Another Russian refinery is burning amid warnings that Moscow is facing a crunch point, which means attacks on Ukraine and sabotage in Europe will likely get worse before they get better. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine, starting with the latest overnight strikes on Russia's oil infrastructure, already under strain, but Ukraine's special forces have hit the Korobovsky gas processing plant in Kotovo in Volgograd Oblast, that is sort of east of the occupied Donetsk region. They've also reportedly hit the Yefimkova linear dispatch station, which pumps the oil. Now, this has been claimed by Ukraine's special forces, and the fires at both of those sites documented by open source intelligence and reported by Russian officials. It's interesting. We've talked a lot about these strikes and the strain that they are placing on Russia. President Zelensky claimed in one of his recent updates that diesel production and availability inside Russia is now 20% lower than what it would normally be. And that's very interesting because experts on kind of fuel or on resilience, on national resilience, when they look at things like fuel supplies, talk about the discretionary margin, if you like, and that's what a country can stop using and still operate. So those are discretionary trips, voyages, journeys fueled by diesel that you don't have to take. Recreational journeys, for example. And 20% is at a ballpark figure for how much fuel, how much of a fuel shortage a country may be able to sustain before it faces some really crunchy impact in terms of its ability to sustain, for example, a foreign discretionary war of aggression. So the fact is we've already seen that these shortages are starting to bite. We've seen petrol stations closed, particularly in Crimea and the far east of Russia. We've seen long queues outside the ones that are still open and extensions of export bans on these fuels to try and ease the shortages. But Ukraine's campaign against the refineries, against this infrastructure, shows no sign of letting up. And I wanted to bring in an analysis by a fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, a think tank based here in London, Nigel Gould-Davies, who has essentially said that Russia is facing a fork in the road where the Kremlin is going to have to make a decision whether it continues to press on fighting for territory in Ukraine because it is facing significant costs if it goes down that path. Significant costs in terms of men and materiel, and significant costs in terms of what it is financially costing the Russian economy to sustain the conflict and what it's losing in terms of, for example, export revenues and indeed availability of fuels, which is a cornerstone of life and the economy. Gould-Davies gives 4 reasons for this, which I want to go through quickly. 3 of them are policy choices he picks out by America, China and Europe. America, crucially, for all Donald Trump's flip-flopping, wavering, warm words towards Russia and that Alaska summit where Trump met Putin, actually, at the moment, Donald Trump has not made a decisive break with Europe or NATO. And in fact, what we've seen most recently is that ramping up of his rhetoric, the sense that Trump feels betrayed by Putin, their relationship. He felt that their relationship, Putin has let him down. He thought the war would be simple to solve, but that because of that relationship failure, it's proved difficult. Gould-Davies talks about reason number 2, Europe stepping up. Now, many of you might question whether or not Europe has really stepped up, but he points to the commitment among European NATO members to spend 5% of GDP on defence. That's 3.5% on core defence priorities and about 1.5% on security and infrastructure resilience, and a commitment or discussions to try and give Ukraine a 140 billion euro reparation loan funded by frozen Russian sovereign assets in Europe. That's something we've really seen causing some anxiety in Russia. Thirdly, and this is interesting, he talks about China's tilt towards Russia. Ukraine's allies now describe China as a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, whereas in the early stages of the war, that language was far more muted, a sense that China was trying to stay neutral, didn't want Russia to be humiliated, but wasn't overtly helping them. Some of those concerns appear to have fallen away. We've talked about the ever closer Sino-Russian military relationship, with China buying training and kit to try and arm an airborne battalion, a Chinese airborne battalion that might be able to land and support an offensive against an invasion of Taiwan. This report, though, talks about the Siberia 2 pipeline, which China has at long last agreed to. This will effectively allow Russia to double its gas exports to China. So essentially this is a reorientation of Russia's economic priorities. It's going to get income from China, but that's not going to come on for many, many years, although that sort of light is being dangled at the end of the tunnel for Moscow. Which means that in the short term, these costs of the war remain very, very acute. The fourth reason is the Russian economy, and the language in this report is quite lovely. It says, like two blades of a pair of scissors, war and sanctions are cutting ever deeper. Putin has said that defense production in Russia is already at maximum capacity. And we know that's putting a strain. That is what's driving growth, has sort of driven growth in the economy, sustained Russian growth despite all of the sanctions, which surprised many people. That's been the focus on military spending. It goes on to say that Russia can only win this war in Ukraine if it can undermine the resolve of Ukraine's allies. It says this compels Russia to accelerate its theory of victory, to grind down Ukraine militarily and outlast the West politically before the window for winning closes forever. For this reason, Russia is now inflicting record drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities to wear down morale and resistance, and is carrying out unprecedented incursions and sabotage operations to deter and divide Europe. And I think the message, the conclusion is very, very clear. Europe must continue to show resolve. The author says, to fear escalation is to invite it. And of course, that comes on the back of the Shahed drone incursions into eastern Poland, the fighter jets loitering and violating Estonian airspace, drones in Romania and in the Baltic states. And that has been matched by strong words from NATO, increased air policing missions along its eastern frontier. But NATO has resisted the opportunity to take any kinetic action against Russian military hardware. At the same time, the Institute for the Study of War, a research group that we refer to quite a lot in these podcasts, has published an extraordinary map showing the potential damage that US Tomahawk land attack missiles could cause. Now, we talked in our last episode about US considering giving them to Ukraine. What the ISW has said, has shown, has mapped the range of those missiles against potential targets. And this is something that came up a lot in the question, so thank you for those. Their assessment is they could significantly damage, if not destroy, key military assets inside Russia. And there are two that stand out. The Shahed drone factory in Yelabuga and the Engels 2 airfield in Saratov, which is a strategic airbase used by Russia's long-range bombers to attack Ukraine on a regular basis. So we talked about the concerns that discussion about Tomahawks has caused in the Kremlin, and that is clearly the reason why. When I was looking at that map, I couldn't help being reminded of what Joseph Stalin did during World War II, this sort of titanic effort by Russia to dismantle many of its arms production factories, tank factories that were located in Western Russia, and move them eastwards, sort of behind, into the Caucasus, into Siberia, to put them out of range of advancing German Nazi forces during World War II in order to sort of increase Russia's resilience. And were missiles, for example, like the Tomahawk to come into Ukraine's possession, or perhaps if the Flamingo proves itself capable, and if Ukraine can produce enough of them, then this is a dilemma that Moscow is going to face. Of course, It's never one way. This has been another week of devastating Russian strikes against Ukraine. Most notably, I think, possibly in Lviv Oblast, which suffered the worst single strike on the oblast of the war. Hundreds of drones and many, many missiles raining down across that western oblast on the border with Poland. We saw footage of industrial plants burning in the aftermath of those strikes. We've seen the port infrastructure hit in Odessa more recently, and what was referred to as a savage attack on a train station in Shostka in Sumy Oblast. That's northeast of Kyiv, of course, on the border with Kursk, where Ukrainian and Russian forces have been battling ferociously, a sort of close quarters battle because of Ukraine's, or as a result of Ukraine's earlier incursion into Kursk. Fighting continues, of course, in the Donbass, in Donetsk, where Zelensky has warned that Russia is going to ramp up its efforts to seize Pokrovsk, the shell of the city that is left, where Ukraine has managed to hold out for months and months. It has been extraordinary. Zelensky saying that increased pressure is partly because of their failure to hold ground in their recent advances around Dobropilly. Remember, there was that sudden spurt using infiltration tactics. Analysts pointing out that those infiltration tactics, which have given Russia some advantage over recent months, probing sparsely manned Ukrainian lines, those are going to become less useful as autumn turns into winter and the leaves fall off the trees, and the cover that foliage provides for infantry troops is no longer there, leaving them exposed to drones, even more exposed to drones, I should say. And on the subject of drones, just before we get on to the questions, there is some extraordinary footage we've seen this week of a Ukrainian drone which lands on top of a Buk mobile surface-to-air missile launcher, which is part of Russia's air defense systems, a Buk air defense launcher. It lands between the missiles on top of a moving vehicle, and according to Ukraine's armed forces, this drone then travels 15 kilometers hitchhiking on the missile launcher before it is eventually discovered by Russian forces. And this footage appears to show the Russian soldiers spotting it, coming up, looking at it, quite inquisitive, stepping right up to it before something happens and they scatter. Presumably they realise it's almost as though it emits a sound. There's no sound on the videos that we've seen. They scatter, and Ukraine said the drone was detonated remotely by its operators, but we don't see that detonation on the video. And there's also some footage of Ukrainian Marines shooting down what it says a Shahed drone with a French-supplied Mistral air defense weapon as well. So both sides, a reminder from both sides of the importance of air defense in this war, with the long-range strikes proving so critical. As ever, thank you for your questions. If you've got them, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. I've got into the comments, I've answered a lot of them there. I've got a few to get through today. A lot of you focused on Tomahawk and Flamingo, comparing the difference between the American Tomahawk, the Ukrainian-made Flamingo. First question on Tomahawk. Why were they not given 3 years ago? They could have saved countless lives. It's a good question, but as ever, with donations of weapons from Ukraine's allies to Ukraine, there has always been three competing concerns. The first is the demands of Ukraine. They have issued the demand signal of what they want, what they need. You remember they've said close the skies, they've asked for tanks, they've asked for F-16s, GMLRS guided rocket launchers, all of these weapons which have, over the course of the war, been delivered. The first concern of their allies is whether or not the delivery of these weapons will trigger World War III. Put simply, that's the concern. Will this be seen, will this be enough of an escalation to trigger an even larger response from Russia? And you remember in the first October of the war, there was real concern that Moscow was on the cusp of firing a tactical nuclear weapon, potentially a demonstration strike over the Black Sea. Most of Putin's threats have proven hollow, and certainly, mercifully, his nuclear threats have proven hollow over the course of the war. But nonetheless, that has remained a concern. And the third concern has been the availability of these weapons in the stockpiles of Ukraine's allies. So those three things: what Ukraine wants, the fear of escalation, and the availability of these weapons. But it's worth pointing out that sometimes it's happened quickly, sometimes it's taken much, much longer. But what we have seen over the course of the war is Ukraine often gets its way with the weapons that it asks for. Storm Shadow bunker-busting cruise missiles from the UK, Challenger 2 tanks, Leopard tanks, Abrams tanks from America, GMLRS and HIMARS rocket launchers, F-16 fighter jets. What about Flamingo? We haven't heard much about it. One of you asked, is it better than Tomahawk? Ukraine has announced that it's making Flamingo, that it's operational, that it's making a handful of them at the moment a day, but it wants to ramp that up. Potentially, it claims to have a range that can match some of the Tomahawk variants, but with a larger payload. The weapons experts I've spoken to suggest that the Tomahawk is more sophisticated, it's much, much more expensive, therefore it can fly lower, it can avoid detection more successfully, and it is hardened against electronic warfare threats. So whilst they will both have sort of devastating explosive power if they reach their target, the Tomahawk might be more valuable because it's more likely to reach their targets. But as ever, we've talked as well about the cost curve of weapons, and if Ukraine can produce more Flamingos more cheaply, then it can perhaps make up for accuracy with volume. One of you asked, what would be the most attractive target if Ukraine had Tomahawk missiles? Well, I think we've probably answered that a little bit with the ISW's mention of the Shahed factory and the Engels airbase. I think Ukraine would stick to military targets, purely military targets, in the event that these weapons were to arrive. And that would probably, not only would that be Ukraine's intention, and its avowed intention throughout this conflict, but it would also be a stipulation of the Americans who provide it. I don't think, for example, we're going to see Tomahawks landing on the Kremlin. And final question is, why is this war forgotten? I think it's a really good question because we don't see Ukraine reported as widely, as prominently on the news or in the newspapers. And I feel that as a journalist working on this subject. You clearly feel that as people who are interested in this conflict. It's been going on for 3.5, it'll be 4 years in February. The tragedy is things like this start to become normal. It's up to us. I'm really glad that you're still interested, you're still watching. I'm certainly still interested, I'm still reporting it. So on that note, thank you very much for watching Frontline. Please continue to watch Frontline. Do ask your questions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.